API. Quite a scary sounding name, actually, but we shouldn't be afraid of APIs. If you're new to this concept, this is going to be a real treat for you, because for most of us, when we learn about APIs for the first time, that's that moment where we can sort of just be in amazement at the power that is in front of us. We go, oh, the possibilities. Because all an API is, fundamentally, is a way for one application, like the one that we're building here, to talk to another application out on the internet. And what that means is that we can leverage all of these incredible tools and services that exist out on the internet and bring their power into our application and our interface that we're offering to our users. So this is what's going to allow us very shortly to take all of the diary entries that a user has created and summarize them succinctly using an AI model that some other company, like OpenAI, has created and made available to us using this concept of an API. Or what we're going to do also over the next few lessons, which is allow our users to start typing a place name and to have Google suggest to us what the user might be trying to type. So the way I'd like to introduce an API to you is by talking about an ATM machine. Because with an ATM machine, to begin working with the ATM machine, you need to provide a credit card or a debit card. And of course, you provide your PIN number as well. That's the first step. So the ATM is your interface with the bank. And the first thing that you do is you prove to the bank via this ATM who you are by providing some form of secure identification, namely your credit or debit card and a PIN number. Once you've done that, a few options might appear on the screen. You might be able to withdraw some money, or of course, make a deposit. You might be able to check your balance. You might be able to change your PIN number. So these are all services that your bank is allowing you to access via this ATM interface. So here's you, the user, interacting with this ATM. And the interaction works basically like this. You're going to click on one of these options, which we might say that you are making a request to do one of these services. And depending on the service, you're going to be required to provide some additional context. So in the case of depositing, you may need to provide also the amount that you want to deposit. And then what the ATM will do is it will provide you with some response. And in the case of a deposit, that might be some display on screen telling you that your deposit was successful and also telling you that your new balance is $200 or whatever your new balance, of course, is going to be. Now, an API works in fundamentally the same way as this. API stands for Application Programming Interface. And the interface part is really the critical piece there, because this is a layer that is designed for a developer like ourselves to interact with. We don't have to know how a deposit is handled behind the scenes. We don't need to know all of the mechanics in the banking infrastructure to fulfill a withdrawal request. All we need to know as an end user or an end developer, in our case, is what options are there, what services does this service provider, the bank, provide via its API, and for each of those services, what parameters or what pieces of information does the API require from us in order to fulfill its service. So in the case of a deposit, we need to provide the amount that we want to deposit. It would be the same thing for a withdrawal. But if we wanted to send money to somebody via this ATM or maybe via our online banking app, we need to provide some more parameters, right? We need to provide the bank details of the person that we want to send money to, as well as the amount that we actually want to send them. Now, Every API provider will provide you an instruction manual of sorts on how to use it. Just like if you buy a new dishwasher, you're going to have an instruction manual that tell you what all the different settings are on that dishwasher and how to use it. So I want us to get practical here, and let's look at the API documentation for an API that Google provide. And this is called the Places API. And I want you to think about the Places API here as the equivalent of our ATM machine for the bank. So the Places API is the interface that Google gives us in order to access some of the location-based services that it provides. And down here are those services, which it's also confusingly calling APIs, but all of these are actually different services that Google is providing to us. These are the equivalent of withdraw, deposit, check balance, etc. on our ATM machine. So what we have here is the Places API. There's one way to think about this. It has these little windows on it that give us access to certain services, like getting a place's details. So how does that work? Well, this is where you would consult the instruction manual for this ATM, right, for this API. So place details, you can see that it describes this as it allows you to request details about a particular establishment or point of interest. And it sounds like to do that, we need to provide a place ID. We don't know what that is yet. We don't really need to know what it is. But for our purposes, that means is we've got here our app, and we can make a request to access this place details service by providing a place ID. So this is the equivalent of asking to make a withdrawal. We provide an amount that we want to withdraw. So in the same way here, we're making a request to get some information about a place, and we're providing with that request a place ID. And then what this service will do, what the Places API will do, is it will respond with some information about the place and provide that information to our app where we might want to use it in some particular context. Now, they also have something here called a text search. So if we scroll down, and the example they give here is spicy vegetarian food in Sydney. So that would mean that to this text search service, we would need to make a request that included what we wanted to search for. So, you know, spicy vegetarian food in Sydney. That would make up our request. And presumably then what the Places API would do is it would take that information, it would do some processing, it would search through its database, and it would return as a response, you know, a few potential establishments. I don't know, Hannah's Falafels, for example. Don't ask me to do the branding for your new vegetarian restaurant, okay? It's not my strong suit. And then what this Places API also gives us, and this is actually the API that we're going to be setting up in our app, so this is the one where we really need to pay attention, is it provides what it calls here place and query predictions in response to an HTTP request, which probably sounds like a bunch of gibberish to you, and that's okay, we're gonna go through it step by step. But in short, for now, what that means in simple terms is we've got this autocomplete service. It wants us to provide potentially a partial incomplete piece of text, what you might hear called in API world a text string. A string is literally just a little bit of text like this. So we might provide here a partial text string, and what the autocomplete is going to do is it's going to try to complete this bit of text, and it's going to send that back to our app. So it might give us, you know, New York or Newcastle, right? It's going to give us the best guess at what it thinks we were trying to say. So what we've just been looking at is sort of a high-level explanation of what this Places API can do for us. But what you'll want to do with any of these instruction manuals is you'll want to find the page that has more details about how each of these services works. And in particular, you'll usually find in the API documentation somewhere a section that looks like this. So this first part, to start with, this is the address for this service, this autocomplete service out on the internet. In fact, these services you might also hear called endpoints, right? This is one endpoint, this is another endpoint, and this is another endpoint. An endpoint is literally just jargon for a URL, a website address out on the internet where we can access this service. So what I want to do now is break down how we actually use this endpoint or use this service, practically speaking. And this big body of code-like text is going to give us a big clue. So again, we've got our app here on one side of the equation, and we've got the Places API on the other. This, of course, this Places API is something that Google owns. This is on Google's infrastructure. So just think about this as one computer, a client, talking to another computer, a server, right? You've seen this distinction now quite a few times. Whenever two computers on the internet communicate, there is this fundamental relationship where the one that is initiating the interaction, which we call the request, that's what's happening when that initiation of the communication is happening. The party that is initiating that is the client, and the party that is doing what we call responding or giving a response, we call that party the server. When two parties like this communicate over the internet, they do so using a structured way of talking, so to speak. There is a protocol for how they communicate with one another. And that protocol we call HTTP. This stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is something that you definitely do not need to memorize. It is just a way of structuring or formatting the communication that happens via this request and then back via this response. It's a standardized way of talking that computers on the internet have agreed to. Now, as an agreed upon set of rules, there's a few different parts that make up this request. There is the URL. So this is just the address for this service out on the internet. So, you know, www. Something like this. Also, what we have to provide here is something called a method. And the method basically says, how do you want to interact with this service? And usually the service will tell you in advance what to put here. So you've got get, which basically means retrieve me some data from this service. This is the same as when we do a search for expression in a bubble, essentially. You've got post, which basically means here's some information, do something with it, and send me back something in response. So in our ATM analogy, make a deposit, make a withdrawal, as opposed to a get request, which might be just give me my bank balance. Put, patch are related to changing specific data in our database. So this might be for changing the PIN number on one of my debit cards. And then you also have this delete method, which kind of says what it is on the tin, right? In the ATM, it might be delete my credit card, so it'll block my credit card so it can't be used. Now, you don't need to memorize these, but you may come across them when you're reading through API documentation. So it's useful to just have a working understanding about what these are. So in the case of this Places API, we might be doing a post request. Then we have something called headers and another section called the body. And together, these make up our request, our HTTP request. And if we get all of these parts right in our request, then we'll get a response that we can actually use. So let's learn how to fill out this request, as well as exactly what the headers and the body are, by actually looking at the Google Places API documentation. And specifically, I want to draw your attention to this part here. So this, believe it or not, is an example HTTP request. This is giving us some sample values, and API documentation will often do this. It'll often provide this format of information within the documentation for you here because it allows developers to very quickly understand how to make these HTTP requests or how to make a request to this particular API endpoint. And this format here is called curl. And with curl, we actually have all of the different pieces that we need in order to understand what information to put into our HTTP request to the Places API. So if you look up the top, we've got here after this -x, we've got what looks like our method. Okay, this is in effect the verb, how we're going to interact with this endpoint. If you scroll a bit further down, we've got what looks like the endpoint. This is the URL that we're going to add within our HTTP request, right? So that's this piece and this piece given to us within this curl format. Now, what about the headers? Well, if we look closely down the bottom of this curl bit of content, we've got this -h over here. And we've got another -h over here. And after both of them is some information. So surprise, surprise, these are the headers. And I want you to notice something about the structure here. Notice how we've got kind of this first part, then we've got a colon, and then we've got the second part. And then again over here, after this other H, we've got kind of one part, a colon, and then a second part. What does this remind you of? Well, what we've actually got here is we've got two headers, one called content type and one called X Google API key. And then we've got two values for those headers. This one, application JSON, and the other one here, which is actually a placeholder for a value that we're going to have to add later. Now, this structure of having a label for some container and then a value for that container is the same thing that we've seen so many different times now, most notably in the fields that we have on our data types, right? Where we've got a label for the field and then we're going to put some value in there, right? Here's the type, right? Here is the title field, and here is the title value. So that's what we've got here as well. And I'm just going to add one of them here for simplicity. We've got our API key header, and then this is going to be some value that we're yet to fill out. And spoiler alert, this is the equivalent of adding in our debit card and our PIN into the ATM machine. This is how we're going to identify ourselves, our application rather, with the Places API of Google. Now, at a high level, these headers is just a place where we put metadata related to our request. So one of these bits of metadata is the API key, which is how we're going to prove to the Places API that we are who we say we are. And then the other one here, this content type, we don't really need to understand this fully. We just need to make sure that we're adding it because that's what Google is telling us it needs from us. But in short, this is just Google requesting to us that whenever we talk to this Places API, we tell it that the information that we are sending is in this particular format. And this JSON format is something that we're going to get more familiar with in just a moment. But for now, very simply, we've got header 1, header 2, and we just need to make sure whenever we're making a request to this API endpoint, we add these headers exactly as the instructions tell us to. And then finally, what about this body section? Well, the body section is where we add the actual content of this request. In our case, for this Places API, this autocomplete, this is where we're going to add the equivalent of our new, right? Where we want to get something like New York or Newcastle back. This is the relevant content that this endpoint is going to use to give us some kind of useful response back to our app. So where is this within our curl here? Well, it's everything here after this -d. So it's actually all of this here. And now this is probably bordering on the abstract now. So I want us to get into Bubble and start setting this up. Specifically, I want us to set up this request in our Bubble app so that our Bubble app is going to make this request to the Places API. And that means that we can then play around with changing the content within this request and seeing how that changes the response that we get back. So we set up an integration between our app and some external API in Bubble by going over to this plugins tab here. And plugins is something that we haven't really talked about yet in the course, but I will link in the description for this video to some information about plugins and how you can use them in your Bubble app. But there's just one particular plugin that we want to add here, and it's not so much a plugin as just another aspect of your Bubble editor that you install here as a plugin. So it's called here the API connector. And what we do when we want to set up another API is we just click here to add another API, and we give it a name that corresponds to the API that we're connecting to. So in our case, this is the Places API. And then down here, if I expand this, this is where we set up an integration between our application and one of the particular services that this API provides. So if it was this place details service or endpoint within the Places API that we were trying to connect to, then I might type in here place details. In our case, of course, it's this autocomplete endpoint that we're trying to connect with. And so I'm going to set this to be autocomplete. And then I want you to notice a few things. One, we've got this drop down, which gives me what looks like those same HTTP methods that we saw earlier. And this is where we can then come back to our API documentation and look at what it tells us. And it's telling us in a couple of different places, both here within this curl and also up here, that what we want to do is set this to be a post request. So I'm going to set this to be post. And then this box here, this is where we're going to put this URL. And if we look at the documentation, we seem to have been provided the URL here and the URL down here within the curl. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it in here. So notice what we're doing. We are here within this API connector constructing our request that we're going to end up sending from our app to the Places API. So we're adding in all these individual fields. Now, back in the API connector, what do we have here? We've got here a section that says headers. So that seems to suggest that that's the place where we're going to add this part of our HTTP request. And if we look in the API documentation again, remember that these -h symbols here signify the headers. And by the way, depending on the documentation, they might provide this information to you in slightly different ways. So here is the documentation for another service. This is called Open Router. This is what we're going to be using very shortly to add AI functionality to our app. And you can see here within their API documentation, under this overview section, they're actually providing us here some extra context about the different headers that we need to provide. So depending on the API documentation, they may provide you this information slightly differently, but certainly the golden standard here, so there is no miscommunication, is having a curl request or a curl body like this be provided. So I'm going to copy this first header label here to my clipboard, and I'm going to click here to add a header. And I'm just going to paste in here that value. So this, in the context of the header, is the key. In other words, the label for this header. And then the value here, the value is going to be this guy here, application/JSON, or as we're going to call it very shortly, JSON. So I'm going to paste that value in here, and then I'm going to add a header, and I'm just going to add in this other one as well, this Google API key. And then for the value, I'm just going to type nothing right now because we're going to fill this in again very shortly. And notice these other two boxes here named private. We're going to leave these ticked as private for now, and I'm going to explain very shortly what this checkbox does. Then finally, if we go down even further, we've got this body section down here. So what we add here is going to be this body that we saw earlier from the curl. And I want us to just linger here for a second because this is something that's really important to all APIs. I'm going to copy this part here. So just after this first apostrophe and before the last one. I'm going to paste this here to a service called JSON lint. And I'm going to do this just so that, one, I can just hit here validate JSON to just get it formatted a little bit nicer. And also just so that we can inspect it here. So what we're seeing here, this sort of funny looking code, is something called, surprise, surprise, JSON. And this stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And again, this is just an agreed upon standard for representing information. And it's very, very common throughout the internet, throughout computers, clients and servers, APIs that talk to one another. And the structure is really quite simple. We start with this symbol here, which we call an opening curly brace. We finish with what we call a closing curly brace. And then everything in between is just a set of key names and key values. I'm actually going to simplify this drastically by removing everything except this one first part of the example JSON here. And whenever you make changes to the structure of a JSON, that's why a tool like this JSON lint is very handy. You can just hit this validate JSON and it will tell you whether or not you've got any mistakes. If I add something that I know is going to cause a mistake, then I'm going to see here that this is invalid. So this is as close to code as many of us will get when we're dealing with Bubble, but it's really important that we do understand JSON if we want to work with APIs. So the way that this works, if I get rid of that comma again, is we've got here a key name and a key value. Where have we seen this pattern before? Well, everywhere, right? Our headers have a key name and a key value. Our data types have a field name and a field value. So we're talking here about a field, we're talking here about a key. What difference does it make? It's the label for a little compartment, a little place where we store data. And with APIs, they're going to tell you what keys and what types of values that they want you to send them in your request. So remember, this is our body here, and the structure of this body is going to be JSON. And the Places API itself, so Google, is going to tell us what it wants within this JSON body. And this curl is just giving us kind of an example. But if we scroll further down, the documentation is telling us here all of the different parameters. This is the same thing as a key in JSON. All of the parameters that we can add to get different responses out of the Places API. And this first one here, input, has this asterisk next to it, which is indicating this is one required parameter. So this API call won't work unless we add this one parameter here called input. And then we've got kind of a whole bunch of other parameters that we can add in order to modify or influence the response that we get back from this API. So if we go back to our ATM example, and the ATM has this endpoint, let's say, to withdraw. So this is an endpoint, a service within the ATM, and then the user over here, I've kind of drawn this the wrong way around, but that's okay. The user wants to make a request. Well, what they might add within this request is a JSON body made up of a few parameters. So they might have the amount, let's say 100, and they might have which notes that they prefer. And let's say that they prefer to have this in $20 notes. And so both of these would be parameters that we have in our JSON body. And in the next lesson, we're going to see another example where we're going to be connecting to this completion endpoint, this completion service of this AI provider called OpenRouter. And you can see here in their example curl, there are two parameters within the JSON body that they want us to provide. One parameter called model and another one called prompt. Now, it's also worth noting that in JSON, you can nest values inside of other values. So right now we have this location bias parameter in the example curl. And rather than this pointing to some other value, it actually points to this curly brace, which actually is the starting curly brace that corresponds to another curly brace down the bottom here, right? And everything in between is in fact what we call in JSON an object, which is just a collection of other key names and key values. And an object is really just the same thing as a data type in Bubble, in that it's just a collection of fields, a collection of different data points. Now, I'm not going to go any deeper than this. I just want us to get a little bit of intuition for how JSON works. Depending on the API that you're connecting with, they're going to request that you give a JSON body in a particular format, or in other words, they're going to ask that you provide certain parameters with certain key names and certain types of accepted values. Now, in our case, we're just going to use this example here. This is the extent of our JSON body with just one input, because it's the only input that we need to provide. Some of these other parameters, like location bias, you can see here that they allow us to specify search results within a certain area. So in that case, if I was providing pizza and the search area of London, then, I might just get pizza results that are only within London, as opposed to pizza results that are also in Germany and New York and what have you, right? We're just going to keep it simple here, and we're going to see how this works really shortly. So I'm going to copy this JSON body, and I'm going to put it inside the corresponding field here within the API connector. And then the next step for us to do is to actually click this button here, Initialize Call. And what this will actually do is it will send a real request from our app to the Places API. The Places API will in turn respond with some data, and we're going to receive that data within our application, and then we're going to see how we can actually process and use that response data in our app. So the first step is always to initialize a new API call. When I hit this, you're going to see that we're seeing this message here. And this is actually the response that we got back from the Places API. The response is just saying, hey, this is an error. You're sending us the wrong stuff here. And it's pretty descriptive. It's telling us that our API key isn't valid. And if I click out of this, it kind of makes sense, right? Because I'm not adding any particular value here. So this is what we usually have to do with APIs, is we have to go through this process called authentication, where we have to provide some kind of valid ID to the API provider, which is going to authorize them to give us the information that we are requesting. In other words, it's going to allow them to identify us and to say, okay, you are allowed to receive this response back. Now, any API provider that does this is going to provide some way within their website for you to generate an API key. And Google's API services are no different. What you'll usually have is a section of the documentation like this, where it says use API keys, and it will give you some instructions. In the case for Google, you will need to set up a cloud console and a billing account, which if you were following along with the lesson where we set up our Google Maps functionality, then you will already have one of these set up. But at any rate, I'll link to the resources for doing this in the description for the video. But it's basically telling us exactly what we want, what we need to do. Once we have an account and we've created a project for our account, we can generate an API key, right? So I got here specifically by clicking this button here. And I will link to all of this, as I said, in the description for this video. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna copy this, and I'm gonna make sure that I close out of this so that everything is enabled. And then I'm gonna paste my API key into the value for this Google API key header. And let's try to initialize once again. And you can see now we're seeing a bunch of interesting stuff that we haven't seen before. We're going to come back and understand what all of this is in a minute, but I just want to have you scroll down, if you're following along, till we see this Show Raw Data button. Because if I click that, then we see what looks like, to me, JSON. And if I just go and copy all of this and put this here into JSON lint, maybe we can see it a little bit easier. This is the response that we just got back from the Places API, right? So this is literally this part here that we just got back from the Places API. And their response, critically, is coming back as JSON, right? The data, the information that they're responding with is formatted, structured in a JSON format, right? So here it is. And we don't necessarily need to understand exactly what all of this information is right now. We just need to understand that it's here within JSON. And this is really important because our Bubble application can interpret this JSON. And what that means is that we can actually extract or make use of the data that's encoded within this JSON structure. So if we just take a look at the structure here for a minute, right at the beginning of the JSON, we have this thing called suggestions, and it's followed by this strange little symbol here, which we call a square bracket. And if we scroll far enough here, there'll be another square bracket right down the bottom. Now, everything in between, so everything that's sandwiched between an opening and a closing square bracket, is a list of things. Just like we can have a list of diary entries, a list of trips that we display within a vertical list, in JSON, these lists live within these square brackets. And you might hear this called within the context of JSON an array of items. That's sort of the jargon for a list within the context of basically the rest of the programming world aside from Bubble. And this is actually really handy to know because if we scroll up, you see that this is Bubble's interpretation of the JSON, this first part here. So it's finding this suggestions parameter within the JSON, which is this guy here. And see how it's determining that that parameter is a list. That's because of the square bracket. Now, underneath or nested within this list is a number of things. So you can think of each of the things within this list as a suggestion. What Bubble here is interpreting as an autocomplete suggestion. That's the label that they're giving here. So just to sketch this out for you, we've got here a list of suggestions. And so this might be suggestion 1. And here's suggestion 1 here. It starts with this curly brace. And for suggestion 1, it's got all of these fields. And some of these are IDs and place IDs that are idiosyncratic or unique to the Google Maps infrastructure, in which we don't really need to understand here. But we also have data points that look like they will be a little bit more useful, like this place prediction, what we're calling here text. So this might be something that we could use in our app. So what we basically have got here is within one suggestion, so we'll just say that for this first suggestion, right, the value of this field text is Pizza Hut, Hermiston. And then within this one suggestion item, maybe we've got another value here called the main text. So the main text is called Pizza Hut. And then if we go down, we've got these other fields. Maybe this other one is relevant for us, the secondary text. We've got secondary, and that's, North First Street, blah, 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 blah. So this is the first suggestion in our list of suggestions that we've just got back from the Places API. But there's going to be another one in here too. And if we look at the raw data, might be able to make more sense of it. So here's this first suggestion, right? So in effect, given the input of pizza, this autocomplete service has sent us back a list of suggestions, places that it thinks that we might be searching for. And here's the first one. And then we can tell that we're on the second one because we've got this little comma down here. So notice how this curly brace, sort of a little hard to tell, is in line with this curly brace up here. So everything in between is one suggestion type thing, right? And then here, after this comma, there's another curly brace facing the other way. So that to me signifies this is the second item, which stops all the way down here. And this second entry also has the same fields, the same parameter names, just different values. So we've got Burntfield Brewing, we've got the address. Google's giving us some kind of guess as to what type of thing that it is. And then down here, we've got another suggestion from Google as to what we're searching for. And so they think, oh, maybe it's the pizza culture Napoleta in Calgary. right? So it's just giving us all of these guesses. And so to complete the picture here, what I can do is I can just hit save. And what I've done now is I have initialized this API call, which means that I can use the data that is returned, that the Places API responds with. I can use that data within my bubble application. Now, what I could also do is change the input here to that other example that we had, new. And if I hit reinitialize, this is the equivalent of making a new call now to the Google Places API with this new value. And I'm going to go and show the raw data because it's going to be easier to see. And you can see here are all of the suggestions, what Google is also labeling as a place prediction for the input value that we provided. So it's guessing, okay, maybe it's New York that you want to see. And so this is one big place prediction now, which is giving me a whole bunch of different information related to New York. The main text is just New York. The secondary text just has the secondary part of the location. And then we've got a list of types. So this is an array, again, because we've got an opening square bracket and a closing square bracket. And everything inside, these are basically tags, a list of tags related to New York. And these types are going to be types that are defined within the Google Maps system, right? The Google Maps database of types. Another guess, it guessed maybe I'm after New Jersey. Another guess, maybe it guessed I'm after Newburgh. Or maybe I'm after Newport. These are all within the US, and presumably if I added in here some location bias, I could influence the type of results that I see. And what we're going to see in the next lesson is how we can actually feed this input value dynamically from an input within our actual application's interface. So if the user typed pizza in our interface, then they would, of course, get results related to pizza. Now, just while we're here, I want to show you that when you come across a new API, you don't have to manually copy across all of these header values, and paste them in like we did the first time around. There's actually a much easier way. What we can actually do is, given that we have been provided by the API documentation how to connect with this API using curl, then what we can do is we can copy that curl to our clipboard, and then at the bottom of the API, in this API connector, we just hit this button here, import another call from curl, and we paste in that curl body, we hit import, and it will just create the entire API configuration for us based off of that curl. So this is a major time saver. So you can see here, it's just added all of the headers, it's added that body, exactly what we need. Now I only set it up this way manually, just really to demonstrate and help you learn what all these different component parts do. But out in practice, you're just going to want to be importing the curl. It's a lot easier and a lot faster. So this has been a lot. What we're going to do in the next lesson is we're going to figure out how we get this response data, these suggested places from Google, to actually appear within our interface so that our users can select them based on some search query. But let's recap what we've just done before we get there. What we have done is we've set up now an integration, as we call it, between our bubble application and some external server. And all that means is that we've configured the setup so that our bubble app can make a request to this external API, this other computer out on the internet, right, with certain formatted information within that request. And then the server, upon receiving that request, is going to do some processing and then respond with some data that presumably is going to be useful to our application, like a list of suggested places that we can then display out in our interface. So we're going to connect the picture here and integrate this within our user experience in the next lesson.